Everybody. I'm Ben Bernanke, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this mini conference on the Federal Reserve's review of its policy framework, which Jay Powell told us a couple days ago will be happening this year and presumably announced next year. The Fed has always had some kind of at least implicit policy framework. In the 1920s, it was the real bills doctrine and the gold standard. 1950s, Martin's take away the punch bowl. 1980s, Volcker and the monetary targeting regime. 1990s, Alan Greenspan's preemption and risk management. But all this was implicit. It wasn't written down. In 2012, for the first time, the FOMC released a statement of principles of monetary policy, which included the famous 2% inflation target, as well as other less well-known but important discussion of trade-offs and so on. So that was the transparent attempt to put a framework out there. But then in 2020, after a period of very low interest rates and low inflation, the Fed conducted a review that included Fed Listens conferences around the country where they heard the input not only from economists but from ordinary folks representing different parts of the society. And in August of 2020, Powell announced a new framework that's modified the policy principles and which has been voted on and reapproved every January since then. But also promised there was a review of the policy principles after 5 years, and lo and behold, we're almost at 5 years. And so the new principles are going to be considered this year and next year. Obviously, as we go into this, the environment is somewhat different from what it was in 2020 when the current principles were announced. So anyway, we want to do what we can to provide input into this set of very important decisions. So our mini conference today has two parts. This morning, we will be hearing two research papers from experts on the Federal Reserve. As you know, there's been a long-standing interaction between policymakers and research economists, including people at the board and outside the board. And we'll be hearing work both on the Fed's reaction function, what it should be, and on the Fed's communication. This afternoon at 2 o'clock, there'll be a more informal panel discussion that David Wessel will lead to discuss these issues. So the first paper today is by Michael Kiley, a long-standing researcher at the board, entitled Monetary Policy, Employment Shortfalls, and the Natural Rate Hypothesis. Michael will have 25 minutes to go into all the details necessary of this paper, and he'll be followed by Michael Bauer, from the advisor to the San Francisco Fed, who will, in 12 succinct minutes, will explain what is right, what is wrong with Michael Kiley's paper. And then we'll go on to a second paper after that. But let me not take any more time and just invite Michael Kiley.
Okay. Well, thanks. I'm really happy to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation from the Hutchins Center. And I think I'll learn a lot from today's discussion, and I hope I'm able to contribute a little bit. I'm going to talk about monetary policy strategies. As Ben talked about, this presentation is based on my recent research on employment shortfalls and monetary policy, which is expressed in two papers, which I believe are on the Hutchins website, but also on the Fed's website. A couple points are important, as I go through the results. Right. First is, this is my independent research, and the views I express are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Board or its staff. And then secondarily, as it says right on the front of all Fed research papers, the point of this research is to stir debate and discussion and to hopefully improve the papers, right? I think there's a lot of scope for feedback, and I welcome any feedback to try to improve the analysis, on these, preliminary research papers. Okay, with that background, let me just launch into what I do in these papers and give you a preview of the answers and then walk through in a bit more detail. So in the research papers, I revisit 3 questions. These are questions that have been asked before. They're somewhat eternal, I suppose. Right. So first I ask, is the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates, right, the fact that nominal interest rates cannot fall much below 0, likely to bind? And if so, what strategies can mitigate any adverse effects? Right. This is obviously one of the questions that has been part of a range of central banks considering their policy approaches over the last 10 years. And there's a lot of discussion about the continued relevance of the effective lower bound rate. So I want to engage in that discussion. The second question I ask is, should policy respond to measured slack? And if so, how forcefully and symmetrically? Right, so this is certainly an old research question. There's a lot of debate about the degree of responding to slack for a variety of reasons. Some of that relates to the measurement of slack. So for example, everyone has difficulty measuring the natural rate of unemployment. It's an unobserved variable. It's one of the stars, as some policymakers have referred to it in the past, that we must infer from underlying data. And the longer run value of the unemployment rate estimated by the Fomc in their summary of economic projections sort of steadily declined in the 2010s, right, as people learned that actually the economy would be at full employment at higher levels of employment and lower levels of unemployment than previously appreciated, reflecting the difficulty of measuring that concept in real time, and then raising the question of how forcefully should policymakers respond to mismeasured economic slack. Similarly, I think economic theory implies that employment shortfalls are much more costly than overruns in employment, right? That's been a bedrock of economics for as long as I've been engaged and goes back a long time, right? And that raises questions, certainly for economists, but also for policymakers, of should they be responding differently to deviations of employment from potential symmetrically or asymmetrically. I think the combination of these questions then leads to my third question, which is somewhat independent but really builds on the answers to the first 2, and that is, how can monetary policy promote labor market strength with price stability, right? How do you achieve your dual mandate objectives in a world in which the ELB may bind and in which you may be concerned particularly about employment shortfalls? Okay. So I'm just going to preview the findings. So I find that the effective lower bound is likely to be a significant constraint, even in the current environment, for reasonable values of the equilibrium real interest rate, and that as a result, make-up strategies will be needed to alleviate the constraint. And in general, there are a wide range of make-up strategies that are effective, right? That a very effective way to stabilize the economy is to deploy the type of make-up strategies that have been, explored. There's no one unique that's much better. A lot of them can be expressed in different words, right, but they accomplish very much the same thing because the underlying policy actions are very similar across a range of make-up strategies. Within a set of strategies, I find, and this builds on a long literature, that strong responses to inflation and activity in a monetary policy rule limit ELB risks, and employment shortfalls. And importantly, an asymmetric shortfalls approach can exacerbate economic volatility and worsen employment shortfalls and price stability. In particular, when we think about trying to limit employment shortfalls, there are 2 ways to do that, right? You can lower the variance of economic activity and hence lower the extent of employment shortfalls, or you can raise the average level of economic activity and hence lower employment shortfalls. And monetary policy's ability to lower employment shortfalls primarily is related to promoting economic stability, not to raising the average level of economic activity. Okay, So what approach do I use to answer my questions? Across the papers, I use two approaches, right? So one is more qualitative, sort of deriving a set of results in a simple New Keynesian model. And the second is more quantitative, right? Addressing the same questions through simulations of a large-scale policy model that's still widely used at the Federal Reserve and has been used in a number of research papers. It's called the FRBUS model. In addition to using those approaches, I try to enrich in the quantitative analysis earlier assessments by considering a number of factors that are less considered in the literature, or at least in the recent effective lower bound literature. The first is uncertainty regarding the equilibrium real interest rate, R star. I'll walk through exactly how I model that and how that's different from earlier approaches in the coming slides. But, this is obviously one of the unobserved variables that policymakers may be looking at as they set monetary policy. And the question is, given that it is unobservable, and given that the level of R star is going to be important for assessing effective lower bound risks, right, what does a reasonable distribution for R star imply for the assessment of that magnitude of effective lower bound risk? The second factor that I will consider is uncertainty, or more specifically mismeasurement of resource utilization. Right? That's obviously important to address the question of, well, should we just ignore this concept which is difficult to measure when setting policy, or should we downweight it relative to the approaches that some may advocate? Maybe I'll just preview that this is important for the questions. I actually find that this is not quantitatively particularly important, even for reasonably large levels of mismeasurement. And I think that's actually, some may find that somewhat surprising, but when I connect it to the earlier literature, I think that's actually a fairly standard finding. So then finally, I embrace alternative views on how economic activity enters the social loss function, and consider both a social loss function that I might call standard, or at least standard over the last 50 years, which is sort of considers the variance of economic activity. But then I also consider a social loss function that focuses only on downside risks to economic activity, so focuses only on employment shortfalls, and try to see whether or not good policies are different across those different loss functions, or if, in fact, at least for monetary policy purposes, good policies are very similar for those different social loss functions. So let me go into those factors in just a tiny bit more detail. And I realize these are a little bit difficult, especially for those in the back of the room to see. And so I'll walk through what's in these figures, which present the magnitude of measurement error that I model in resource utilization, and the range of values of R star, the equilibrium real interest rate, that I consider in the analysis. So the left-hand figure presents the mismeasurement in the output gap. Right? It's centered on 0. So on average, policymakers are going to get the output gap correct. But it has considerable dispersion. So the standard error in the symmetric distribution for measurement error in the output gap is more than 2.5 percentage points. Right? So if one were via Okun's law to translate into uncertainty on the natural rate of unemployment, it's that 30% of the time policymakers are more than 1 percentage point off in either direction on their estimate of the natural rate of unemployment. So that's significant measurement error. And that's similar to the type of measurement error that was found in an older set of papers by Athanasios Orvanidis and others, where measurement error was quite large a long time ago. I think you could argue that measurement error is even lower today. I'm not going to, I personally probably suspect that, but I'm going to embrace the notion that measurement error may be quite large. On the right-hand side, I present the distribution for the equilibrium real interest rate in the simulations. And I want to focus on this just a little bit more. Again, I assume that it's symmetric. It helps make the simulations easier. And I assume it is centered on a real interest rate of 2%. Right? So that's sort of a value that is very common in the literature and would have been viewed as a reasonable value of R star, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Recently, many people have viewed R star as being much lower. Right? this distribution is assumed to have a standard deviation of 1 percentage point. So for example, in the quantitative evaluation, there's only a 15% probability in any given simulation that R star is lower than 1 percentage point. And so, for example, in the most recent summary of economic projections from the Federal Open Market Committee, those report a value for the long run nominal federal funds rate of 2.8%, as the median across participants, which implies a long run real interest rate of 0.8 percentage points, right? So that would be relatively low relative to this assumed distribution. So, some may view this as being, optimistic on what R star might be. Others may view this as being taking into account like current levels of real interest rates, and maybe we're in a regime that's different than the 2010s. But in any event, I would view this as not overstating the likely value of R star based on recent data and estimates in the literature. Okay. So then finally, let me just briefly show and then turn to results what I do for loss functions. So the first is a quadratic loss function involving the deviation of inflation from its objective and the output gap, right? So that's symmetric. Positive output gaps are viewed just as costly as negative output gaps under this loss function. It's very standard in the literature. Right? The second loss function I use is a quadratic loss function for output shortfalls, right? So that's the same loss function in terms of inflation deviations. Symmetry is preserved, right? But only squared values of output shortfalls or employment shortfalls, loosely speaking, are considered, right? So under this evaluation of different approaches, right, no penalty is applied to strong economic activity, right? But a penalty is applied to very weak economic activity, right? And this could be viewed as capturing the idea that policymakers view output shortfalls as especially costly. And it's certainly been used in other research, in the last 10 years. Okay. All right. So let me turn to my first question, and that is the effective lower bound likely to bind? In the paper, I consider a number of rules on the quantitative analysis, and here I'm going to focus on results for an inertial version of what's been called the balanced approach rule. So this is a rule that's widely used, in similar research papers, and in some, policy work that you can see from the Federal Reserve and things like the Teal book or elsewhere. So under this rule, right, the response to inflation is 1.5, right? So it satisfies the Taylor principle in the long run. The response to the output gap is symmetric and equal to 1 in the long run. But there's partial adjustment in the short run, and persistence in the interest rate. The table shows outcomes, given that assumed distribution for the effective lower bound and incorporating that measurement error and the output gap. For output, inflation, the frequency of the effective lower bound, and the value of the loss function under both the symmetric loss and the shortfalls loss. And these will appear in subsequent tables as well. The first set of columns are under the balanced approach rule without any makeup strategy, right? So it's just you follow the rule at all times. And what you see is that inflation does not equal the assumed objective of 2%. Output also is sort of systematically falling below potential. And those standard deviations, for those of you who are familiar with the value of the output gap, a standard deviation of 3 3/4% or 2.5 on inflation are somewhat high relative to historical experience, right? So the economy is not being stabilized in a way that's desirable. I should note, right, that in these simulations, and this is something that's very common in the literature, right, they show shortfalls of inflation and of output from potential, right? What that shows in these simulations, right, because this is a computational approach, that actually agents expect in the long run output to equal potential, and for inflation in the absence of shocks to get to 2. Right? So what this, and this is very common in these literature where you have to use like piecewise approximations to solve models. They're not global solutions, right? That this is showing a failure of the economy to be stabilized, right? And that failure is actually inconsistent with the structure of the model. So I don't take this as necessarily saying these are the right numbers, right? What this is saying is this approach is not stabilizing the economy. It's failing to do what it should do in terms of the model, or arguably in terms of what policymakers would hope. The second set of columns then adds a makeup strategy, and this adds a particular kind of makeup strategy for illustrative purposes that was proposed by Dave Reissnader and John Williams nearly 25 years ago, in which you accumulate foregone interest rate cuts, and then you use that as a stock to decide how you set the future interest rate. And I do that partly for completeness, and also because it's a really good strategy in the FRBUS model, where that particular interest rate and how it affects financial conditions is very directly part of the monetary policy transmission mechanism. And what you see is that stabilizes output at potential and achieves the inflation objectives and brings standard deviations of both inflation and output back to sort of historical typical levels. A key thing there, right, is that the effective lower bound is binding 15% of the time, even though on average the equilibrium real interest rate is 2%, right? Now, some may say, well, that's sort of surprising. We thought for a real time that the equilibrium real interest rate was 2%, and we didn't talk for a long time necessarily about the effective lower bound. I should remind us that that's not actually true. We did talk for a long time about the effective lower bound. Larry Summers raised concerns about the effective lower bound around 1990, right? If you look at the historical record of how much federal funds rates have been reduced in recessions, right, and this is in a series of papers, Dave Reissnader and I have emphasized this in research papers, the average decline in the nominal federal funds rate during a recession is 5 percentage points, right, over history, when inflation was much higher and arguably the equilibrium real interest rate was 2 or higher, right? So if you think of the steady state nominal interest rate as 4, history suggests, not model simulations, that the effective lower bound is going to be a problem, right? You don't need to do the fancy math, but the fancy math helps you think then about strategies to address it. Okay. So then with regard to strategies, the second half of my first question, there are a lot of makeup strategies, at least in these models, do the same thing. What they do is they promise to be more accommodative and hence to have inflation run higher, and that helps stimulate the economy. And so what I do is walk through a set of threshold approaches, which are something that Charlie Evans, when he was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, emphasized, and that I worked on in earlier work with Ben and John Roberts, arguing that these are sort of both have been used and are explainable, that I promise to maintain interest rates at the effective lower bound until inflation reaches a certain level and or the unemployment rate falls to a certain level, assuming that it's high because we're in a recession when the effective lower bound binds. I know these are hard to see, but the takeaway is that the symmetric losses and the shortfall losses, both are lowest for similar strategies, and that's when the unemployment threshold is a little bit above or near the natural rate, and the inflation threshold is around its objective of 2%, and then that creates, outcomes very similar to the Reissnader-Williams rule, actually a little bit better, but really is effective at stabilizing the economy. But threshold approaches can go too far, right? If you have a threshold for inflation somewhat above the target, or especially try to promote a really strong labor market, even the shortfalls loss, right, deteriorates very, very quickly, because what you do is you create economic instability, and that will feed into the later results on asymmetric approaches. Okay. So then my second question is, should policy respond to measured slack, and if so, how forcefully and symmetrically? So in the papers, I examine a large set of coefficients in a reaction function. And in general, stronger responses to inflation and output stabilize the economy better in the FRBUS model, but that's actually true in a large range of models. And this is actually a very old result, right? So some of you may remember that the Taylor rule was presented at the Carnegie-Rochester conference 21 years ago. There was another paper there, the Henderson-McKibben, which considered rules of the same type and in the same set of models, and actually stabilized the economy much better because it responded much more forcefully to inflation and to output. And most papers since then have found the same thing, right? And that happens to be true here, even with measurement error, because the measurement error does not overcome the fact that, output helps tell you, if you're sort of in a boom-bust dynamic, right? And hence, it's effective to respond to output and to do so very forcefully in addition to inflation. And that can be shown, right, in this rule in the first column where you can see the standard deviations are lower, the shortfalls loss is much lower, in what I, in the paper, call the preemptive rule, and that's responses of 2 to output and 2 to inflation in the long run. Okay. I also consider a shortfalls rule, and I consider a number of them in the paper, But the one I consider here is the analog to the balanced approach rule, but that only responds to negative output gaps, doesn't respond to positive output gaps. This is a rule that you can see in a variety of research papers. Similar rules, have appeared in the Monetary Policy Report. And what you see is that this does not stabilize output. The standard deviation is very high in the simulations, and actually average output is very, very high. You might think that's really, really good, but then going back, right, what this says is that the economy is not behaving in a manner that's consistent with what the model expects, right? So actually, this is not a good sign that output is high. It shows you that actually you need to go back and say what's happening here, because your simulations are off. Nonetheless, taking them at face value, the shortfalls loss is actually much higher too, because what you're doing is you're increasing the variability of activity by not trying to stabilize the economy when the economy is strong. Okay. So then, to the last question, and this really pulls together, some of the results, but also considers some robustness factors. How can monetary policy promote labor market strength with price stability? Well, symmetric policy responses promote stability, right? And stability promotes limited employment shortfalls, right, by reducing variance. Not by raising average activity, but by reducing variance, which is what monetary policy can do. In contrast, asymmetric policies can lead to a deterioration in stability. And while you may think that an asymmetric approach helps you on your employment shortfalls objectives, that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, what I find is that is not the case at all. I consider, although somewhat qualitatively, the robustness of these conclusions to a variety of risk management considerations. I do, in one of the papers, consider the interaction of these various strategies with quantitative easing, right? And ask the question of, well, if quantitative easing is also forcefully responding and there's a makeup strategy, right, can they work well together? And the answer is yes, because the makeup strategy, right, responds as soon as it needs to, right? As soon as those thresholds are reached, you respond forcefully and stabilize the economy. And similarly, if there's a lot of fiscal stimulus, right, as soon as the thresholds are reached, you act to stabilize, and the economy works well for those symmetric makeup strategies, but not for asymmetric strategies, right? Because if you do, either on a fiscal or monetary policy side, accidentally provide too much stimulus, you do not act to remove it quickly enough in these asymmetric approaches, and that is destabilizing. Okay. I think there are other interesting questions to consider, but that I don't quantitatively evaluate, such as, are there nonlinearities in the Phillips curve? I think those might actually point in the same direction on how you view symmetric versus asymmetric policies, but I don't formally consider that. I ask whether policy is robust to unmodeled costs and benefits of a high-pressure economy. I think one that, in principle, could override these sort of conclusions is actually that monetary policy can just raise the average level of economic activity, right? And that would be a good thing. And that's not actually a feature of these models. And so if monetary policy is not approximately, and I guess I would say approximately, not like literally, long-run neutral, then maybe actually monetary policy should try to boost the economy. When I read the literature, most of those sort of long-run effects actually are about what I would call negative hysteresis, and that's the risk that a weak economy scars potential. And there's much more limited evidence that a strong economy boosts potential, but that certainly could override the sort of conclusions that I reach. So then let me finish with 22 seconds, right? So I find that the ELB remains a significant constraint, hindering the achievement of price stability and full employment. Makeup strategies, help overcome the effect of lower bound. I also find that symmetric policy reaction functions mitigate the most adverse types of employment shortfalls by contributing to economic stability, right? And that is something I think we all agree monetary policy can achieve. And then finally, I find that asymmetric approaches, can exacerbate economic activity and actually be counterproductive. Of course, all of these results rely on this particular model. I think it shares or models that I consider. And I think these are sort of mainstream. They capture what many people view as a reasonable view of the monetary policy transmission mechanism and how the economy operates, right? But it's certainly not definitive, right? So this is just one piece of research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss these papers. So grateful to be given the opportunity to read two papers of Mike's, very insightful pieces of analysis. I should say that the views I'm going to express here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of others at the Fed. Okay, so what Mike sets out to achieve in his research here in these papers is a model-based evaluation of different policy frameworks. So, I mean, at a basic level, he's comparing different monetary policy rules and then calculates, welfare or loss and evaluates the performance of these rules in kind of a model-based setting. Okay, so two types of models. One is these kinds of, three equation models, as we like to call them, standard New Keynesian models, where you can do like analytical derivations and get some basic intuition, and then quantitatively uses the Furbus model and variations of the Furbus model to, do this in a more detailed model, a little bit more realistic model. Okay, so the key findings I see in this research are three. One is that makeup policies are very effective. They can really, alleviate the likelihood of ending up at the zero lower bound. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Reif Schneider-Williams policy rule, for example, or these threshold rules, that really works very well. The other aspect is that a strong response to economic slack really improves the performance, even though you may be mismeasuring slack. And then the third part, that's maybe a little bit more controversial, or in the grand scheme of things, and this broader debate, is that focusing on employment shortfalls can exacerbate shortfalls and create inflationary pressures. So that's the title of one of the papers, and I'll focus on this part. So, the Fed has, as Ben has described, operationalized its dual mandate in different ways. And in 2012, it explicitly stated that it was going to focus on, quote, deviations of employment from its estimated maximum level. And that was changed in 2020, as most of you know, to, quote, focusing on shortfalls of employment from its estimated maximum level. So why did we focus on deviations first, and then why are we focusing on shortfalls now? Right? I mean, so of course we were focusing on deviations because a hot economy is going to lead to inflationary pressures, and the price stability mandate requires us basically to be, avoiding this, right? So the focus on deviations was really the price stability mandate, the inflation part of the mandate. It, of course, doesn't fall from the mandate, part, the maximum employment mandate, that you should be leaning against an overheating economy, right? So just to make that clear. So with this logic, though, with the overheating economy and avoiding leaning against that, there's some problems that have motivated the focus on shortfalls, right? And there's two problems with this kind of Phillips curve logic in practice for monetary policymakers. The first is that you need an estimate of the natural rate of unemployment, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It's kind of a weird misnomer, but NAIRU, we can just say NAIRU, and that's fun to say, and also a useful concept. But it's very hard to estimate. Going back to research by Stock and Watson in the late 90s, you get these wide confidence intervals around estimates of U star. And so it's kind of a tough, tough spot that you're in if you're relying on that for monetary policy. And then also overheating or unemployment being below U star, will only lead to inflation if you have a Phillips curve that is, steep, or, if it's not dead, right? People have been talking about, is the Phillips curve dead? So there's a lot of research that the slope of the Phillips curve has potentially flattened. So this was an issue in the 2010s, and certainly in the since COVID, this has only become worse. Like, it seems like unemployment gaps and inflation seem pretty disconnected. So relying on this Phillips curve relationship for monetary policy can be problematic. Okay. So that's one reason why, leaning against overheating is a little difficult. So Mike does this analysis in this, very consensus kind of broadly used class of models, but there's other models. And he was alluding to that in the end of his talk. One is this kind of plucking model view of the economy, goes back to Milton Friedman, recent research by Duprass, Nakamura, and Steinson. In that view, economic fluctuations are drops below full potential. And in that world, if you stabilize economic activity, you can raise the average level of employment and output. And so then you can really improve welfare by leaning against shortfalls. An implication, by the way, of that view of the world is that you use standard models, standard methods to estimate U star, you're going to overestimate it. So maybe that's part of the reason why, we had to continually revise down our estimates of U star. There's other ways that, asymmetries, downside risks could matter for welfare and for business cycles. That would also motivate a focus on shortfalls. Of course, business cycles are very asymmetric, right? If you look at plots of the unemployment rate, it just drops very gradually and then, shoots up during a recession. So whether this is endogenous, or whether these are kind of asymmetric shocks, business cycles are very, very asymmetric. And that's not the case in standard new Keynesian models, right? There, loss function is quadratic, shocks are symmetric. So, these asymmetric features of the business cycle are important, though, outside of these models. And another thing that Mike mentioned here, these positive hysteresis effects, I think there's some evidence in that direction, but more research is certainly needed to know whether positive hysteresis is important. So running a hot economy can kind of raise employment and lower unemployment rate in the longer run. But there's pretty solid research that there are distributional benefits that disadvantaged groups in our economy benefit disproportionately from a hot economy. So these are reasons to focus on shortfalls if we go beyond standard models. Okay, so then there is the possibility of inflation bias. Right, so Mike was, talking about how if you focus on shortfalls with an asymmetric rule, then you may end up with inflation that is above the target. And there's other research by board colleagues and further back that goes in the same direction. So that is potentially problematic, right? We do not want to cause an inflation bias. On the other hand, the zero lower bound, of course, causes a downward inflation bias. There's a paper that Mike wrote with John Roberts a few years back that shows this, and there's other research, including from my colleague Thomas Mertens with John Williams. This is all pointing in this direction that zero lower bound is a serious issue, and there's this potential slippage. This is, like a downward drift of long-term inflation expectations below the target that we have witnessed over the 2010s that were pretty disconcerting. So Chair Powell in his 2020 Jackson Hole address was talking about this persistent undershoot of inflation that's a serious cause for concern for policymakers. So in a sense, if you focus on shortfalls, and this does raise long-term inflation expectations a little bit, this could kind of undo this and could kind of, go it could be welcome. But of course, and Mike writes this in his paper, it's not we don't know that that's going to even out to actually reach 2%. So this is, qualitatively, these might offset each other. But it's not clear that it's going to get us to the right target, okay? So Nicola Petrosky-Nadeau at the San Francisco Fed, my colleague, and Brent Bundig from the Fed also, they have a paper that emphasizes this point, but they say, look, if the central bank then puts more weight on inflation deviations, then you can actually kind of have the cake and eat it too. You can focus on shortfalls, and you can have the benefits of that, and you can reduce the likelihood of hitting the zero lower bound. And at the same time, you can avoid inflation bias. Right? So they say, you can achieve your inflation objective on average while still significantly reducing the probability of encountering the zero lower bound. So I think that's an interesting thought experiment, and maybe the current policy actions could be viewed as, in this light, that there's really a really strong weight in the loss function on deviations of inflation from its target. Does the introduction of the shortfalls approach introduce inflation bias? Here's a plot. It's by no means conclusive evidence on this question, but it shows long-term inflation expectations. And the introduction of the new framework in 2020, when you see the slippage, the market-based inflation expectations over the next 10 years in teal, I guess, are, kind of drifting down over the 2010s. And this got policymakers very concerned. I think that's what Chair Powell was referring to in part in his Jackson Hole address. And, this increase in long-run inflation expectations certainly was not only due to the introduction to the new framework. There's a lot of other things going on, including a pandemic at the time. But, if you kind of squint at it, do some ocular econometrics, you could say, okay, maybe we were around 2%, now we're back at 2%. So it's not obvious that this new framework introduced a bias, an upward bias, or at least that we're now undesirably high with these long-run inflation expectations. Okay, one thing that I haven't talked about, Mike hasn't really talked about, but that's very important, obviously, and we'll hear more from experts in this area, effective communication about monetary policy. Right? All these models assume, aside from the knowledge about R-star that Mike modeled as, incomplete, but beyond that, it assumes complete information. And a lot of research has demonstrated the importance of incomplete information and learning. And, Eric Swanson and I have a couple of papers where we focus on the incomplete information about the reaction function, and that can cause monetary policy surprises and what you can do about that and what that means for empirical work in macroeconomics. And I have more recent work with Adi Sunder and Caroline Pflüger, where we estimate perceived monetary policy rules, and we show they really vary quite a bit over time, and they differ from any reasonable estimates of the actual rules at certain times. And these perceptions really matter for the transmission to financial markets. And then, of course, now we have the if I may call it, the Bernanke review. A lot of people have called it this, where Ben has emphasized the importance of communicating and providing signals about the reaction function of a central bank in the case of the Bank of England. So I'm saying all this because it's important for policymakers to explain policy and to convey information about the reaction to economic conditions. A lot of research has shown this. And maybe the shortfalls approach is easier to communicate. I think for, mitigating deviations, as in the old framework, is a little bit hard to explain. And in fact, there's a footnote from Chair Powell in this address I've referenced where he says, in practice, the committee has not conducted policy in this way, really just leaning against a hot labor market just for the sake of it. And so the focus on shortfalls is, of course, directly tied to the employment side of the mandate, and so easier to explain. So, takeaway, really important research. There is some very difficult issues by focusing exclusively on shortfalls and not stabilizing unemployment around a natural rate. It really kind of goes against a lot of standard macroeconomic analysis. And so we need to think really careful about this. But on the other hand, in the practice of monetary policy, because of incomplete information, because of things we need to estimate, there's also some, and because of the asymmetries in the business cycle, there's potentially some really good reasons also to focus on employment shortfalls. Thank you very much.
Thank you for very informative presentations. And the floor is now open. Questions? Brian? Do we have a mic, please, up here?
say your name.
So thank you. It's a great paper, great discussion. I think these papers are really useful for thinking about the problem at hand and, including the earlier research with Ben and kind of use them to think about the case for average inflation targeting. But I wanted to ask a question, which is, do the papers kind of overstate the problem? Because you have simulations with an R-star 2 that have average inflation at 1.4. The earlier papers with Ben and John had inflation averaging something like 1%. And if you look at inflation expectations even before the adoption of average inflation targeting, they were much closer to 2. I mean, the board's common inflation expectations measure, I think, never got below 2. Market-based measures, which you showed a chart of, but I think that looked a little more dramatic. But I think the right way to measure market expectations, they may have been, a tenth or two below 2. So I guess my question is, even without average inflation targeting, did policymakers solve the majority of the problem just by taking a more aggressive approach than the balanced approach rule in an inflation targeting regime without average inflation targeting? They did QE, they did guidance, maybe they had just a more aggressive rule when they got near zero. So that's the question. Thanks.
Why don't we take just a couple questions? Then Bill English over here, please.
Thanks very much. Sure. Bill English, Yale University. A question for Mike. I thought your focus on the kind of more aggressive rules raised an interesting issue. I'd been thinking of the shortfalls focus as, in a sense, a movement along the Taylor frontier. You could get a lower variance of employment and output at the cost of a higher variance of inflation. Maybe that's a good thing. And what you were suggesting, I think, was that with a more aggressive rule, you could move to that frontier from some place that's just worse with a higher variance of both. I wanted to see if I'm understanding that correctly.
Okay, one more, and we'll take John right next.
William Cunningham, Creative Investment Research. I think you said something about minority groups benefiting more in an overheating economy. So
Sorry,
if
identify
you
yourself, please. Sorry.
William Cunningham,
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Creative Investment Research. So if you could expand on that a little bit. Did I hear that correctly, by the way?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, very good.
Okay. I think those questions are general enough that both of you could have some reaction.
So maybe I'll start and take the first two, and then maybe you can take parts of what you want on the first two and the last one. So just first on Bill, on the Taylor frontier, I mean, that's exactly how I express it in the paper, that I think there is a large literature that, the standard Taylor rule or the balanced approach rule are not actually on the Taylor efficient frontier, and that, there are benefits to trying harder to stabilize the economy, right? But that requires, more active monetary policy responses. Now I think that actually happens in a lot of models, but there obviously is a lot of experience that, suggests that maybe those models are missing something because people don't want to go there. But I do think the models suggest that. And it is about, that's literally how I express it in the paper, getting closer to the Taylor variance frontier. So Brian, on the, is the problem overstated? I'm highly sympathetic to what you say because of what you said at the end, right? I think the problem is not that, inflation is going to fall off the cliff or output be very weak, right? Because, in fact, for a long time, including researchers, including those in the Federal Reserve, like Dave Reisschneider and John Williams, or, like you and Ben and others of different ways to think about, like, how to affect the yield curve, that would provide stimulus. That in fact, the simple rule with no quantitative easing, with no forward guidance, is not what was happening, or is likely to happen. I do think that's important to remember, though, because I do hear, researchers or at conferences, people saying, "Oh, like the ELB is just not an issue. Why are you focusing on that in your strategies?" And the fact is that and maybe they even say the same thing that you did, right? But it was important that actually policymakers did act to provide make-up policies and did act to provide stimulus through quantitative easing, which is a complement to make-up policies or even a, substitute, right? And that I think that's really the takeaway. There are a lot of things, they actually have been executed and they have been effective.
I do think the problem is potentially overstated. The zero lower bound problem, in our standard models leads to, periods at the zero lower bound are predicted to lead to higher macroeconomic volatility because monetary policy cannot stabilize the economy as well. But there's research, including a nice paper Eric Swanson has with John Williams and also other macroeconomic research that shows it seems like at the zero lower bound we do not necessarily see higher macroeconomic volatility or less ability, and Eric has some other work showing, that at the zero lower bound, it doesn't seem to be that the Fed is so much less able to provide, monetary stimulus. So just from that perspective, I think maybe the zero lower bound is less of a problem in practice than in standard new Keynesian models. Yeah, on the, I was citing research on the, benefits of, a hot labor market for disadvantaged group that I don't know in very much detail, but there has been a lot of, my colleagues at the San Francisco Fed and across the system have done work that shows that, I think the headline finding is that you can actually reduce inequality a little bit with a hot labor market because lower income groups benefit more from a strong expansion. There's a lot more in that line of research, and I have some links in my slides. Maybe they will be online, but a quick Google search of the research of my colleagues at the San Francisco Fed will have much more on that. Thank you.
Okay. John Faust, do you have a question right here? And Eric, you're next. John.
John Faust. So I really liked the paper, and I found the results really interesting. One aspect of it, though, bothers me, and it's an aspect that's happened in lots of other papers. So I think it's worth thinking about. To me, you've got to implement the framework. Informally, you've got to implement the framework some way that characterizes what the framework's actually about. And in my view, the framework puts practically the prime directive is inflation expectations being 2%. So I'd view that as a side constraint on any implementation of the framework. And then once you view that as a side constraint, that long-run expectations are 2%, which is, I think, the only way to think of the framework, then a lot of the results would change. Not all of them, but a lot of the welfare results turned on the fact that there was a bias. And so I think we ought to all consider whether we need to model the framework differently.
Okay, Eric here, and then David Romer next.
So I'm Eric Swanson. I have a question about the shortfalls rule and how you're implementing it in the model. These shortfalls rules or price path targeting in general work fantastically in rational expectations models. There's a lot of concern that that you're not going to get some of those benefits in actual financial markets and with actual firms and households. And so I'm curious, did you do robustness analysis in the paper? Or are you looking at models with VAR expectations? And are you really going to get many of these benefits in models where expectations are not so perfectly forward-looking?
David.
David Romer, Berkeley. A comment about the objective function and then a follow-up question. The comment is the asymmetric loss function where you only penalize shortfalls. I think that's essentially impossible to justify. So the theory argument is we know that Y star or U star are inefficiently low. There are positive marginal tax rates, there are markups, and so on. So theoretically, it's good to be, if we could be above normal output all the time, that would be great. And the common sense argument is you never hear people complaining, oh my God, the unemployment rate is too low. We're really unhappy about that. They may worry about the consequences. So it seems to me the right loss function has essentially quadratic, but not with a maximum at Y star, but at someplace above Y star. And then so you basically have a linear term and a quadratic term. And then the question is, in these models, would a linear term matter at all? until you get to a world where you have the potential to raise average output, there are tons of benefits from being above the natural rate, but but monetary policy can't get us those. And the question is that a correct description of these models that you're looking at?
Okay.
Sure. So maybe I'll go in reverse. So in the smaller theory paper, I do consider a more general loss function for exactly the reasons that you state, right? And what I don't consider, but I reference a large literature, is the purely linear quadratic case, right? So there are, I won't go into the details, but I don't have the extreme case of no weight on positive. But in the pure linear quadratic case, actually, when you do the optimization, you get very different results because the linear term essentially drops out only as an inflation bias. Like that was known a really long time ago. All right, but it may be that that quadratic approximation to the social loss function is not so good, and so I consider asymmetry in a different way and get some different results where the variance is changed. So, but I totally agree with you that that particular objective function is an extreme case. It is an interesting case because it has been appeared in a set of research papers recently, and you can even see it in the publicly available versions of the Teal book and the optimal control simulations that are done for the Fomc, so I think it's relevant to consider. Eric, with regard to makeup policies and managing expectations, I think you're exactly right. In this particular analysis, that's one reason I use the FRBUS model, because it has some flexibility in implementing expectations. I used model consistent expectations in financial markets and in wage and price setting. So arguably, both of those are debatable, and especially in wage and price setting. We actually considered the threshold rules in the paper with Ben, John, and I think Ben considered them also in his own work under a variety of expectations. And with being able to manage financial market expectations, and I take the point that you may not be able to do that perfectly, but there is evidence that you're able to do that somewhat effectively. That's really what you need in the FRBUS model, right? You don't need to be managing households, and you don't need to be managing inflation expectations in the Phillips curve. You need to be managing the monetary policy transmission mechanism, and then things work well for these makeup policies in the FRBUS model. And then John, I agree with you, right, that the framework should achieve 2%, right? And what or the strategy should achieve 2%. And what I'm doing is examining a whole set of rules, right, and showing that if you believe in that side constraint, for example, this particular shortfall rule doesn't satisfy that side constraint, and so it's an inadmissible rule, right? But there are a lot of rules that do it, right? And so I think I'm doing exactly what you ask of, like, you need a policy that satisfies that constraint, and these shortfalls policies are not it.
Okay, other questions? Right here.
Hi, John Hilson-Rath. I wanted to understand a little better what you mean by symmetric and asymmetric. And in particular, I'm wondering if you look at symmetric responses to inflation, undershoots and overshoot, but asymmetric responses to shortfalls of employment, since that's in the mandate. I also want to throw in a question about the model, the FRBS model that you use. My understanding is historically there's not much of a financial system in there. And do you have a financial system in your simulations, and how does that affect things if you do?
So I have a question, Mike. So one of the things in practical policy making is that unemployment and inflation are not symmetric in timing. There's the usual issue that unemployment you observe currently, but inflation has long and variable lags, as somebody once said. And at the same time, you're learning about the inflation situation. So think about the Maestro episode where you're trying to figure out, was it supply or demand, et cetera. Think about the recent episode where it was not clear how much was fiscal, how much was supply. But the word preemption didn't come into your talk. And does uncertainty, the asymmetry in timing, is that captured, and is that important? One more question. Any others? Where? No. Okay. We'll take your responses to that. And
sure. So then again, maybe working backwards. So clearly in the model simulations, I don't take into account in any direct way, trying to think about differences in timing, right? So I'm using simple rules that respond to current inflation and the current output gap, and maybe have some inertia. Now, within them, you might imagine, it would certainly be possible to do things like forecast targeting rules, where you're forecasting over some horizon, or responding to forecasts in a reaction function over some horizon that may help with the timing, because you may know that the history of the economy, that a current set of shocks, has either more long-lasting or more short-lasting effects than a shocks at some other time, and so your response to a forecast would be different than your forecast to current. I think on average, like in a big model simulation, right, simple rules that respond to forecasts or to current conditions are going to be pretty similar. The models just aren't that complex, and the forecasts, depend a lot on history, even just for those two variables, right? So I don't think that at least FURBIS is a tool that tells you a lot about the relative benefits of forecast targeting versus, rules that involve current conditions. So then, John, on the on financial markets in FURBIS, so there's a rich monetary policy transmission mechanism. So there are a lot of interest rates that affect spending and things like that, but there is not a financial sector with a balance sheet that could be affected, that may cause problems from time to time, right? That's a richer model. It's not that those things aren't important, but they're not in this sort of baseline case model. It's not, so I think it could, right? But it's not obvious that it would actually, right? And that's one reason why it isn't in the core model, that it's important at times, but may not be important for sort of strategy discussions on average, right? That I don't know that it would affect particularly what a good strategy is, right? But that, I can't say that's a theorem, right? That's a conjecture, right? And it reflects, I think that's basically why these things aren't in the core models, but at times they are important. With regard to asymmetry, and the shortfalls and sort of what I'm considering, I think one thing that I do want to emphasize, which I hope was clear in my remarks, right, but is, Michael brought it up. I think it's implicit in your question and some other questions, right? I take as given that it is desirable to mitigate deviations, employment shortfalls, right? That's actually a premise of the paper, right? And so it's not whether or not that is the objective, right? It's, right, how do you actually do that? And do you do that by responding relatively symmetrically and stabilizing the economy? Or do you do that by responding asymmetrically? And I think in a class of models, I think in most models it will be the case that reducing variance is going to be beneficial. It's going to help mitigate employment shortfalls. And in fact, in the models that I consider, that's basically what monetary policy can do, right? And so it's not whether or not it's desirable to focus on employment shortfalls. I actually take that as a given. That is an assumption. And I think that's what economic theory implies, right? So it's just, how can we achieve that, right? So actually the sentence in the framework, right, and I think this is more general than the Fed's framework. I think it's important for economists to think about, right? But the sentence is that they seek to mitigate employment shortfalls. And that's what I'm seeking to mitigate. And symmetric rules are what do that, right? That's the result, right? It's not questioning in any way that that is desirable. I think economic theory, subject to David's, right, point that the loss function is almost certainly not literally what I did. I just take that's a given. With regard to what I did on asymmetries, right, it was just considering different responses to positive and negative output gaps. Certainly there is a literature that considers different responses to high or low inflation relative to target, and I didn't consider rules of that type.
Just two quick points. One, we haven't talked a lot about the natural rate hypothesis, but this is the hypothesis, of course, that monetary policy cannot affect unemployment in the long run, and this is baked in some form or another into New Keynesian models, maybe not exactly, but approximately in the FURBIS model as well. And I'm not so sure that we still believe in this hypothesis. With hysteresis effects or in the plucking model view, this is this hypothesis does not hold, right? This assumption does not hold. So I think it's important to think about, the performance of policy rules, policy frameworks in models that deviate from that as well. That would be a useful complement to Mike's work, or maybe Mike can do it. And the other part was, the preemption. This is a big topic. I'll keep it short. I just want to say that I totally agree. Inflation, we all know inflation reacts with long and variable lags, and we don't know how long the lags are, and maybe unemployment reacts more quickly, and so we need this forward-looking indicators of where inflation is going. And this is also something that's really hard to capture in these models, right? In these models, it's in particular complete information models. You kind of know where things are going, and you react to that. But I want to plug in some more Bay Area stuff. So, John Steinson recently at Hoover gave some comments, and he wrote these up in a piece that's available on his website, where he really emphasizes the importance of preemption in monetary policy. That just has to be a part of the framework. There's a lot of empirical research that shows that is important, and so it's I think the focus on employment shortfalls is not at all at odds with focus, like a forward-looking focus and preemptive approach to policy.
Thank you.
I'm going to, I once said that monetary policy is 98% talk and 2% action, and on that basis, 98% of today's session is about to occur. We have a paper on communication by Anna Cieslak of Duke with co-authors Michael McMahon and Hao Peng. It's called "Did I Make Myself Clear? The Fed and the Market in the Post-2020 Framework Period," and Anna will be presenting. Thank you.
I should mention, which I should have said, that all these papers and the slides are on the Brookings website if you're interested.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me and my co-authors to present. Mike McMahon and Hao Peng are both in the audience. So let me start with the statement of longer run goals. It clearly says that both clear communication and long-term interest rates are central in achieving Fed's objectives. So now, why does clear communication matter? Well, Fed works through actions and words, and that affects long-term interest rates, then financial conditions, there is a big trap here, and economic objectives. But long-term interest rates are not just expectations. They also have this tricky component of term premia. And so what we have argued in a series of papers, including this one, is that there can be a Fed-induced uncertainty channel that operates with communication, whereby markets' perceptions of potential policy mistakes due to communication failures can raise term premia against policy intentions. Now, we've been asked to think about communication over the past 5 years and to provide some critical assessment. We should say that over the past 30 years, monetary policy has been incredibly successful, and the last 5 years were also incredibly difficult. So whatever we say has the benefit of hindsight that policymakers obviously didn't have at the time that they were making their decisions. These has been incredibly eventful years with shocks that were very difficult to anticipate. Now, with benefit of hindsight that we do have, a luxury in research, we have some lessons. So communicating reaction function should be a focal point for the FOMC. That involves communicating well-argued economic assessments, and uncertainty surrounding those assessments. Management of expectations is important, but forward guidance can be constraining, and appearance of being constrained can undo some intended policy. Now, what is our diagnosis for the post-2020 period? The framework in 2020 focused on one dominant scenario. We know the parameters that were assumed. It got tested on an alternative scenario that was not zero probability at the time of implementation. And there is evidence that some observers were aware of those other scenarios that could unfold. And here is a clairvoyant quote from Greg Ib. There was an attempt to establish credibility for the framework combined with forward guidance that sort of delayed response to inflation. What happened in terms of the market's perceptions? It seems that the communication post-framework introduced some uncertainty about reaction function. Then the concerns about mistakes as shocks started coming online raised term premia and in part unwound the easy conditions that the Fed was initially aiming to achieve. Hawkish pivot and communication associated with it prevented in part further increases in term premia. As a matter of background, let me just start by saying that the Fed and the market's expectations of inflations were largely consistent. What that also means is, in terms of point estimates or certain central tendencies, forecast errors ex post were similar. Okay? One thing to highlight about when we are going into the review period is, however, the tail risk perceptions. When you stare at this graph on the left, these are the market's perceptions, and you can see that there was very little time variation during that review period in 2018 in the perceived left tails of inflation. However, in terms of Fed left tail perceptions, which is the right graph, you see strong updating to appreciate more and more the downside risks to inflation. So it seems that it is possible that the markets were less worried about inflation undershoots than the Fed was going into that framework review period. Now, what are the communication successes and failures the way we see them over that period? Framework in 2020 was deliberately, by design, unspecific about implementation. It turned out that the fate modifiers, flexible average inflation targeting, were difficult to explain, but the public was seeking clarity on those aspects. Forward guidance was initially a communication success in that it allowed to anchor short rates firmly where the Fed wanted them to be, but it turned out to be overall a failure because it introduced an appearance of the Fed being constrained by these pre-commitments. Inconsistent communication 2021-2020 into 2022 induced public uncertainty about the reaction function. So we start by going through the market noteworthy communications by the Fed officials surrounding the overshooting. As I mentioned, framework was relatively unspecific about details, and that was by design. The willingness to overshoot, however, was clearly communicated in advance. That was a communication success. But when questions started to emerge, it was clear that Fed officials in their communications did not agree on some of the key parameters of that design. And we collected all the numbers that market noted about the degree of overshooting that policymakers found acceptable. Now, the initial period was associated with trying to build credibility and combined with forward guidance. So what you can see in this graph is, while there was no agreement on key parameters, there was very strong agreement at some point that risks of inflation are strongly weighted to the upside. That's the only moment in history of the Fed's dispersion index where everybody agrees that risks are tilted to the upside. But what happened to the even most hawkish forecasts over that period for the Fed funds rate? They were strongly anchored at 0. So this is the delay that I meant. Okay? Despite the risks being tilted to the upside, there was resistance to express that in adjustments of the FFR forecast on the side of FOMC. The communication that was associated with that period was gradually becoming less dovish, more hawkish. That is shown by, we code the language of policymakers, that's shown in the red line, increasing. That's less dovishness, more hawkishness. However, until mid-2022, what you also see is large dispersion of views that were presented. That collapsed. There was more uniformity in communication only post mid-2022 pivot. We argue that this communication that occurred fostered uncertainty in financial markets, and in particular, uncertainty about the reaction function. So what you see here is just forecast dispersion among professional forecasters in survey of primary dealers about the short run Fed funds rate and longer run. The forward guidance was successful. It anchored expectations in the short run, but the longer run expectations started fluctuating soon. Now, this is not explained by forecasters' disagreement about macro. So how do we get at the question whether there was uncertainty about reaction function? We have narratives. We use narratives from Wall Street Journal over that period. It's more than almost 8,000 different articles. And we score those articles on the perceptions of different types of Fed-induced uncertainty. About a quarter of the articles over that period seem to suggest there was an increased uncertainty about inflation reaction function. So we constructed index of when the reaction function uncertainty in terms of inflation response starts increasing, and it happens early 2021. There are some interesting moments how that object fluctuates. That index of public perceived inflation response uncertainty is strongly correlated with the disagreement about the longer run path of the Fed funds rate in the minds of market participants. There is very little uncertainty simultaneously about how the Fed would be responding to the real economy. Now, what are the implications for long-term interest rates? As I mentioned, communication and longer run interest rates go hand in hand and are obviously important for transmission, as is recognized in the opening paragraph of the statement. Now, to nail the causality between the Fed and interest rates, we use a bunch of approaches. One of them is to focus on narrow event windows. So we are going to use both the narrow windows around various FOMC events. We are using monetary policy decisions, press conferences, minutes, speeches, interviews, and other important communications by officials. And we are also going to focus on a bunch of key macro events. And we want to see how interest rates responded, how they were updating, and then answer a question why they were updating in a particular way. So here is overall what happened over that 3-year period from introduction of the framework to 2023 August. The 10-year yield rose by 360 basis points. 150 basis points of that increase took place in 30-minute windows around these macro announcements. Minus 40 basis points happened on Fed communication events within those narrow windows. And 250 basis points, which is 70% of the overall increase, is something that we don't capture, okay? It's outside of the windows that we explicitly timestamp and characterize. How do we interpret this? Do we interpret this as a success, communication failure? That is unclear because markets are, as news comes in, markets are also updating their beliefs about what appropriate monetary policy stance should be on macroeconomic news coming in. Also, these numbers can reveal updates to investors' perceptions of where short rates are headed or their perceptions of risk. So we need to decompose these movements. Let me start by showing you what happened just around FOMC communication windows. These are all these various events that I listed. Initially, worth highlighting, through late 2021, the forward guidance worked its way, and there was no movement in the short-term interest rate, 2 years out. I'm using here 2 years, 10 years, and 30 years interest rates. It's not exactly 30 years duration, it's shorter, but it's the longest that we have, longest maturity that we have. When the Fed started pivoting, that was my plot with communication becoming gradually more hawkish. You see two things happening. People started updating on the short-term interest rate, the 2-year one, that's the red line, and also the long-term interest rates started changing course, ending up at minus 40 basis points that I mentioned initially. Interestingly, when you look at the macroeconomic windows, macro events, you see that over this entire period, the updates were suggesting on and on more and more tighter and tighter interest rates. Again, as I mentioned, this could suggest updating about what the appropriate monetary policy stance is, with market signaling we actually want more or we need more. Premia might be increasing and short rate expectations might be increasing as well simultaneously. It's useful to put these things next to each other. You see y-axis is very different. On macro events, you get to 150 basis points over this time period with steep increases starting from mid-2021. On Fed events, you go down to about 40 basis points at the end. Now, the communication over this period introduced some volatility in financial markets. And one example of this is the June 2022 75 basis points moved. By historical standards, the volatility that this introduced was very large. So going into that period before June meeting, there was broad agreement, it seems, from accounts, from expectations, that public expected a series of 50 basis points moves. That was well communicated and well anticipated. 2 days before the meeting, the markets got a signal that a much bigger move might be on the way, 75 basis points. That is when the Wall Street Journal article appeared. And there was significant updating about financial conditions becoming tighter. You see immediate, almost 20 basis points reaction in the 2-year yield. Expectations adjusted. 2 days later, that was confirmed by the actual monetary policy decisions, 25 basis points extra to what was planned or anticipated before got priced in. But that entire effect got unwound at the time of the press conference. After the press conference was done, we were, in terms of the short-term interest rate and short rate expectations, exactly at the point where we started. Okay? So if the goal was to tighten financial conditions through short rates, that didn't seem, at least instantaneously, to achieve that objective. You might argue that the market just thought the Fed is now shifting the time of the tightening, but the terminal stance has not been updated. You could think about benefits of doing that, despite that volatility that we see, that there was a strong signaling of the Fed's ability to act very aggressively and front-load tightening. But there could be also costs that need to be understood, with Fed being accused of overreacting to news, panicking, or confusing investors, and these costs should be considered in communicating in the future. Now, we want to understand to which extent the movements that I showed you are due to short rate expectations versus term premia. And we have this idea in mind that Fed-induced uncertainty could affect term premia by markets perceiving some probability of there being a policy mistake. So we will try to do that split into how much is short rate expectations, how much is term premium in these movements that you have seen, using two methods. One is Fed board's own decomposition at the daily frequency into expectations and term premia. The second one is something that Hal and I have been working on in the past, where we try to provide a more granular split of types of news coming out. And in particular, we want to remove any hedging properties of bonds, flight to safety type of effects in bonds in response to exogenous uncertainty. And we have an identification strategy that allows us to identify this type of risk premia that we find interesting in thinking about Fed-induced uncertainty. We will use that CRP object, which we call common risk premium, moving stocks and bonds in the same direction, as a proxy for Fed-induced uncertainty in combination with Fed communication events. So here is what happened in terms of expectations and term premia using the decomposition from Kim and Wright. On the left-hand side, you have the 2-year ahead expected short rates. On the right-hand side, you have the term premium. Consistent with the forward guidance, there is no movement in short rate expectations. There is significant movement in term premium that reaches, at the peak in April 2022, 76 basis points. That tightening also happens outside of the FOMC communication events on macro events. When you look at the Fed-induced uncertainty premium on Fed events, it seems to raise the long-term interest rates by 86 basis points by the time of the peak in April 2022. Switching communication from very dovish to more hawkish seems to prevent further increases in term premium. Now, what does it mean in terms of how sensitive interest rates are to news that are coming out from the macro side? So on the left-hand panel, you see responses of 2- and 10-year interest rate to surprises to core CPI inflation. Positive surprises across the different sub-periods are very clear. When you start decomposing these reactions, however, you see that initially the responses are channeled through the term premium, and only later the short rates are starting to react as well. Okay? So that red coefficient is the pre-hawkish pivot. When you further decompose those reactions, you see that the entire action initially takes place in that common premium component, which is the Fed-induced uncertainty proxy, and only later short rate expectations start to be updated. Now, can we somehow link the movements in premia to those perceptions of policy mistakes? That is very hard. We use, again, a narrative approach. We analyze Wall Street Journal articles to classify them into a probability that they actually reveal uncertain or policy mistakes. That's an index that we create that has some interesting turning points. Now, let me just show you that all these narratives about the policy mistakes occurring with some probability are associated with higher term premium. You see this in the Keyman Wright decomposition, that's the second row. You also see this in that Fed-induced uncertainty component of the yield curve reaction. Now, what happened post-pivot? The Fed, you could see, was able to counter risk premia starting from early mid-2022. What happened? We go into all the speeches delivered by chair, vice chair governors. We quantify their language to construct a measure of verbal hawkishness versus dovishness. They are policy stances. And what we show is that more hawkish, determinate hawkish consistent communication turns out to reduce term premia over that period. All these results accrue post-pivot, and you see negative signs, meaning more consistent, tight policy communication alleviates some concerns, resolves some uncertainty. So that is a communication success happening post-pivot. Now, what are our conclusions? And some people, including today, said very precisely 98 talk, only 2% action. Ben also said, which is less cited, that there is cost of sending signals that are actually wrong. And when risk premia, term premia are involved in the communication game, Jeremy Stein said, our grip as policymakers on the steering wheel is actually weaker than it would be otherwise. What this takes us to say, together with the results that we presented, communication is hard. It is essential for preventing the likelihood of these policy mistakes being perceived and adding to premia, which may go against desired policy stances. But for the next review, what we would definitely recommend is to spend effort and research on figuring out the theory of optimal communication design, where there is not much clarity, and also have quantitative evidence of what are the successes and failures of different communications. I want to close by saying that risk management remains in vogue today, and it's useful to go back and think about the 2004 quote by Greenspan, who was thinking about risk management as being a crucial element of policy making. And that was allowing the Fed to maximize the probabilities of achieving the goals. And so we have documented that this way of thinking has been the hallmark of Fed's deliberations and decision-making between 1987 and, where our sample ends, 2015, conveniently before the latest episode started. We also established, in joint work with Michael, that presenting verbal scenarios to the public, that the Fed is forward-looking and considers options that are different from current policy, which might be implemented if needs arises, serves to reduce uncertainty in financial markets and alleviate some concerns. It seems to remain a sensible strategy today. We have a bunch of recommendations that the Fed might want to consider, and I will leave it to the panel to discuss those additional recommendations, and we can take it to the Q&A. Thank you. No, you should warn people. I remember this happened to me before, actually.
For inviting me to discuss this paper. I'll start by noting it's very well written. It's very thorough. I was reasonably well informed about the flexible average inflation targeting framework before this, and this paper filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge. So it's really very, very informative. There's many examples and quotes and anecdotes. They have quotes from newspaper articles as well as FOMC members. There's extensive discussion of the successes and failures of the framework. It's anecdotal and informal, but still very insightful. It's sort of like a recent economic history paper, right, for recent history. And so it's just a good retrospective on what went right and what went wrong. There's, in addition, high-frequency analysis of interest rate changes around macro announcements and FOMC announcements and communications. There's textual analysis of newspaper articles using ChatGPT. And then there's some discussion of interest rate expectations versus term premium responses. Let me summarize their conclusions. Okay, so I don't get any animations, I guess. Is that right? They killed all my animations, so anyhow. The 2020 flexible average inflation targeting framework was a mistake. The paper essentially comes to that conclusion. It's I think, a fair they give a fair criticism, and ultimately it's critical. Okay, it was designed to handle one specific problem, the effective lower bound, but in the end, the problems that they faced were more general than that. The policy was very difficult to communicate. It increased market uncertainty. There's some evidence it increased term premiums, and they argue that it ended up constraining the FOMC. That I actually disagree with, and I'll talk more about that. They argue that the classic risk management approach is better. Anna referred to that at the end. I agree with that as well. The Fed should be more explicit about the bands around pi star. In particular, they shouldn't worry so much if they're undershooting by a small amount. They got very, very worried that they kept getting a little bit below 2%. And in retrospect, we wish we were only missing by that much nowadays, right? I mean, they got way too worried about small undershoots, and now we're in a much bigger problem. The Fed should give scenario analysis. I'm neutral on that, but I think it's something they should certainly think about. I think Ben has argued for this for the Bank of England. And they argue the Fed should publish the Teal Book forecast or details of the SEP, and I disagree with that. So the things we agree on, I won't talk as much about. I'll spend more time talking about where I potentially disagree with the paper. I will mention one of the points of the paper is that inflation targeting was really designed for clear communication. Okay, that's one of the main points of inflation targeting. Here's a number of quotes from Ben Bernanke when he was chair, and then also from the book by Bernanke, Laubach, Mishkin, and Posen. Here in red, I've highlighted some of the key phrases. I won't read through all of these, but there's things like, the communication, the efforts by inflation targeting central banks to improve transparency and communication have been crucial to the success of the targeting regime. So there's lots of talk here about how communication is really one of the main points of the whole inflation targeting idea. Yet in the paper, they provide extensive evidence that this flexible average inflation targeting framework was vague by design. So it's actually working opposite to the goal of inflation targeting for clarity of communication. Policymakers themselves did not agree on the details of the framework. The paper makes this point very clearly. The markets and the press sought more clarity from the policymakers, and they were rebuffed because the policymakers themselves didn't agree. Term premia, there's some evidence that term premia increased, market uncertainty increased. The framework seemed to lead to market uncertainty and confusion in 2021 as inflation started to take off. So in many ways, this flexible average inflation targeting framework was a giant step backward in clarity and communication and accountability. Okay, so there's a lot, and the paper I think makes essentially all these points, and I agree with all of these points. A second point I'll make is a table that Anna showed. I'll focus on part of the table here. And so this is a summary of high-frequency market responses to FOMC announcements, that's the yellow column, and high-frequency market responses to chair press conferences, that's the green column. This is from 2020 to 2023. And just look at those numbers for a second, okay? They don't agree. They go in the wrong direction, and this should not happen, okay? If there was good, clear communication, the press conferences should not lead the markets systematically one way or the other relative to the announcement coming out of the FOMC itself. And instead, ex post, during this period, the Fed chair's press conferences systematically, effectively contradicted the message coming out of the FOMC, right? So you have the FOMC moving the markets one way and the Fed chairs coming and moving them the other way. And ex post, the Fed chair moved them the wrong way. The Fed chair was wrong in this case. It's clear evidence of a communication problem. I mean, ex post, the FOMC communication turned out to be more accurate and the chair less accurate, but one way or the other, they didn't agree. So there's a communication problem going on. And ex post, the FOMC communication was better. It's not clear that this is due to the flexible average inflation targeting framework, but it might have been, right? I mean, the chair is placed in an awkward position of a framework that's very hard to communicate. And so he's having trouble communicating within that framework. And so ultimately, the bad framework may have been hurting his ability to communicate and leading him to make mistakes. One of the goals, one of the points of the Bernanke, Labick, Mishkin, and Posen book is that by having such a simple framework where you just have to hit the inflation target, all the explanation should be about here's what we're doing and why it's related to the inflation target. And it would make the communication simpler, and presumably by simplifying the story, the chair would be able to line up with the FOMC communication a little better. Here's a figure that Anna showed. This is figure 11 from the paper. This is June 15th, 2022, the day of the first 75 basis point increase. And this is just one example where the FOMC communication and the chair are at odds. The FOMC comes out and does the 75 basis point hike. The market takes a lot of signal from that, as they probably should have. And then during the press conference, Anna had the quote up there, the chair kind of pushes back on that and says it was a big move. We don't see it being very common. Gives the markets the impression that this was maybe a one-off kind of a decision, right? Or maybe a very rare kind of a thing. And ex post, that was wrong. Okay. I found this as well in research with a former student of mine, Vishuddhi Jayawakrama. This is a table from our paper. If you look from 1988 to 2019, this includes the first part of Powell's term as well. The Fed chair typically is more important even than the FOMC announcements themselves, and they both lead markets in the right direction. These positive numbers show that the communication is leading the markets in the right direction every month. Okay. From 2020 to 2023, the story is very different. The FOMC announcements are helpful in moving the markets in the right direction. The Fed chair's communication is not, and the press conferences are a mess. Okay, the press conferences here are completely leading markets in the wrong direction during this 3-year, 4-year period. Okay. So ex post, this was a serious communications failure, and as long as the Fed is going to review this framework, they should be looking at these episodes as well. Okay, this is something you want to do a postmortem on. My third comment is that the paper sort of buys into this story that the Fed was constrained by its forward guidance during this framework in 2021 and 2022. And so I want to push back against that. So here's just some background. Here's what inflation looked like in December 2021. I did it here for CPI because it comes out a little more quickly than PCE, but the story for the PCE price index is basically the same. So you have sort of the hockey stick going on in CPI. And now here's the summary of economic projections in December 2021. So you have on the left, their forecasts that have highlighted for core PCE inflation. And then on the right, you have the dot plot. And so the market, the FOMC thinks that they won't raise interest rates very much. So that's the circled part of the dots there. And so maybe you might say, oh, that's because they're constrained. They don't think they can raise interest rates very much. But now look at the circled number for core PCE inflation. Okay, they have inflation coming back down to 2.7% at the end of 2022, and they don't have to raise interest rates very much to get there. Right? So this does not really look like the FOMC was constrained. This looks like they just thought inflation was transitory and would come back down, and they wouldn't have to raise interest rates very much. Okay, so this does not look like a constraint story. If the Fed had been constrained in December 2021, those SEP interest rate forecasts would have been hitting the constraint, but instead the FOMC soon even set interest rates much higher than that. Okay, so ex post, it doesn't look like there was a constraint there. And then if the FOMC had been constrained, those SEP inflation forecasts would have been very high, but in fact, those SEP inflation forecasts were very low. Okay, so that again does not look like a constraint. So the Fed, the FOMC will sometimes argue that they were constrained, but it really just looks like the monetary policy in late 2021 and early 2022 was set based on a bad assumption that inflation would be transitory. Okay. And so the paper buys into this story that the Fed was constrained. I think there's not very good evidence that that's the case. I hear some strong evidence that they were not very constrained. It was just a bad forecast. Okay. My fourth comment, the paper argues the Fed should publish, I'm going to argue the Fed should publish the SCP after every meeting. Okay. The paper argues the Fed should publish the Teal book, especially the staff forecast. The problem I see with that is it puts political pressure on the staff. It creates a significant risk of biasing the staff forecast. So for example, there have been times when the staff has changed their forecast dramatically. That happened in 2008 and 2009. There were times when they would revise it a lot. And they might be afraid to do that if their forecast is going to be put under a microscope by the markets and by people on Capitol Hill. Okay, and I think you want the staff forecast to be unbiased and the staff's true best estimate of what's going to happen. Instead, I would take the paper's suggestion and just modify it a little bit. I'd say just publish the SEP after every FOMC meeting. The SEP, I think, is a fantastic resource. It's very, very informative. Just look this past week, right? I mean, everybody knew what the decision was going to be for the federal funds rate. What they cared about was what are the dots going to look like, and the market moved a lot based on the dots. And it would be very helpful to have those dots again after the next meeting at the end of July, but we're not going to have them, right? And we should. It's very easy to put those dots together. It's very easy to put the SEP forecast together. It avoids political pressure on the board staff. It's minimal additional work for the FOMC members and their staff. So and I don't think you even have to do, I don't think you have to connect the dots to the macro forecasts. I think the SEP is great, you know, just as it is. It would just be a huge improvement to have it 8 times per year instead of only 4. Okay, so I would take that recommendation instead of the paper's recommendation. My final comment. The paper seems to regard as equivalent changes in the term premium and changes in short-term interest rate expectations. They do not necessarily have the same effect on the economy. I have a paper with Brian Sack and Glenn Rudebush where we make the point that the term premium can change for many reasons, and different reasons imply different effects on the economy. Okay, so it's not clear that they're equivalent or offsetting or reinforcing, okay? So I'll give you a little example here. Suppose, just for simplicity's sake, a long-term real bond has no risk premium. Let's just say everything is locked down, there's no uncertainty about real rates. And then the comparable nominal bond has an inflation risk premium on it, so that it's got a term premium there. And in equilibrium, firms and lenders are indifferent between the real bond and the nominal bond, and so there's no advantage to doing one or the other, borrowing one or the other, or lending at one rate or the other. And now suppose that inflation risk premium goes up. Okay? In equilibrium, firms and lenders, it's an equilibrium, so the firms and lenders are still indifferent between the real bond and the nominal bond. It's no better to borrow at one or the other. It's no better to save at one or the other. It's just a fair compensation for the risks. So in this case, the higher term premium does not imply lower investment, okay, because the real rates are unchanged, right? So there's no extra incentive to invest. The term premium movement is not equivalent to a change in expected changes in short rates. It's not offsetting or reinforcing. It's just an independent movement in the term premium, and those sometimes have different effects than changes in expected short rates. Okay, so I'm out of time, so here's my summary. The paper is an outstanding summary of the Fed's flexible average inflation targeting framework. It's very thorough and informative. The authors, I think, are very fair but ultimately critical of flexible average inflation targeting. They're taking a communication point of view. The first paper we had was more about a quantitative macro modeling point of view. So the communication point of view is that this was detrimental. They suggest the Fed should return to a risk management oriented approach. And then I have the comments. This sort of summarizes the comments that I had. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much both to Anna and Eric. The co-authors, you're here, and it's Hal. You want to come sit next to? So if you have a response if you'd like to interject, by all means, raise your hand. But Anna will represent you for the moment. Okay. And if you want to respond to things that Eric said, also just weave them into your, into your discussion. Okay, do we have any questions? Yes, back here. Please state your name.
Hi, Samim Gamami. Thank you for a very insightful paper. So my question is, how much of the results do you think are a function of the fact that the revised monetary policy framework coincided with the COVID shock? So that's the first part of the question. The second part is your views on forward guidance. I mean, do you think that in a regime where monetary policy may need to be a bit more coordinated with fiscal policy, I mean, what would be the usefulness of forward guidance in that type of regime? Thank you.
Over here.
Yeah, hi, Nick Timmerouse of the Wall Street Journal. I had a question for Eric really about the disconnect between the communications that we get at 2 p.m. versus the press conference at 2:30 p.m. And I guess my question is that happening because, if that's happening because the chair is not doing a good job of communicating on behalf of the committee, that's one problem. If it's because the communications that come out at 2 p.m. Are not doing a good job of communicating on behalf of the committee, perhaps because the median SEP gets caricatured sometimes by the market, or maybe it's because you see that some of this in the transcripts, maybe people in the meeting are punting difficult decisions out of the statement and into the press conference. And so if that's the case, I wonder, how would you fix that? What would you suggest to do? I mean, if it's a chair problem, then there's not much you can do about that. But if it's a 2 p.m. communications problem, and you're doing another framework review around communications, what would you do to improve that?
One more question. John, go ahead.
John Hilsenrath, just related to that, you suggest that the committee should produce an SEP for every meeting. I believe that would be putting an added burden on governors and presidents who only do it quarterly. So how do you respond to that? And I'd also like to ask the whole panel, given this disconnect that Nick talks about, rather than doing an SEP every meeting, maybe there shouldn't be a press conference after every meeting. Should there be one 4 times a year like Ben Bernanke used to do?
Okay, that's both of you can respond to that, Anna?
So I'll go with the first question. So in terms of how much it was COVID, well, you know, the constellation of events is very complicated. There was COVID shock, and there were then inflationary shocks later. It seemed like the 2020 framework came at a good time to actually address another zero lower bound episode. So you may think about this in that way, in a scenario where the Fed probably thought there are not that many additional options left to address the weak economy. But there was some underestimating of the amount of demand that would come online related to the fiscal expansion that was arguably unprecedented. That probably was not appreciated at the time how big that would be. And additional types of shocks, especially cost push shocks that were also occurring at the same time. Now, in terms of the overall, let me just tie it in. In terms of our overall evaluation of the fate, we think there are very good arguments, theoretical arguments for why it was implemented the way it was. Now, we sort of have an ex post assessment that it looks like a mistake, but we also acknowledge that the benefits or potential benefits might be earned at yet another zero lower bound episode, and that remains to be seen how big these benefits might be. So I just wanted to put it out there. We agree on the broad thing, but there is the nuanced assessment, given that we actually don't know whether it will work with another zero lower bound encounter.
So I'll start with Nick's question. The short answer is I don't know the answer, right? I mean, there's this sort of, is it an FOMC communication problem? Is it difficulties putting together the statement? Is it difficulties with the dot plot? Or is it really just the chair's mistake? It could be a little bit of both. I think this is something that really the people at the board who are heavily involved with this may have more insight on it and ultimately may have to dig into a little bit to figure out. I do think, I mean, the example of June 5th, I think it's June 15th, 2022. I mean, I think that was the chair's mistake. I mean, he should not have come out and said this was like a one-off kind of a thing, right? I mean, the markets took the correct signal from the FOMC action. Presumably, the FOMC would not have done 75 if it was a one-off thing. The chair, it just seems like the chair was trying to, try to tone down the FOMC statement a little bit, and it was just the wrong thing to do. So I think it would be good for the chair to go back and look like, maybe he made some mistakes. And you want to avoid repeating those in the future. And then there's the broader question, like how much of this is difficulties with formulating the FOMC statement, and so that I think has to be dug into. As far as putting the SEP together every 8 weeks, so should they do a press conference every other FOMC meeting? The reason why they did it every meeting is because there was evidence that the FOMC was unwilling to change interest rates at a meeting unless there was a press conference. And so because they had settled into this rut where they weren't going to change things except once every other meeting, they said, we got to get rid of that problem. We want flexibility to change at every meeting. So then you just have to have the press conference every meeting, okay, given that was what they had settled into. It's not much more work to produce an SEP after every FOMC meeting because the board staff is already doing the forecast every time. I was at the San Francisco Fed when we were doing these every other time, but on the staff, you're making the forecast every time anyway. It's just a matter of filling in the survey online and making sure it's correct and making sure the comments are reflecting the views. But it's relatively minor work, given that you've already put the work into making the forecast anyway. So they all have the forecast. It's just a matter of typing it into the computer and then publishing it. So I think that the marginal work is very small.
I'm sorry. A comment from the co-author.
Nobody answered the forward guidance question, so let me answer that one. Thanks, Eric, for your comments, but I actually think the more constraining, or the thing that created the appearance of constraint, was more the forward guidance. And so there's 2 points that I'll make. When they implemented it for the first time, Kaplan disagreed, and I think for very prescient reasons. He sort of said, if we have the right framework, if fate works as it's designed, we don't need forward guidance because you will all update your expectations that we're undershooting, therefore we'll have to overshoot, we'll be loose for longer. And I think the second, where I would say there's a mistake or a missed chance, was the omission of escape clauses in the expression of that forward guidance. These were not ruled out by the framework statement. They are in the last paragraph of the framework statement. And there's an argument about whether they were actually included in the statement. They were in a different paragraph, and there's something which, if you look carefully, you can see a kind of escape clause. But if you've become attuned to forward guidance by the ECB, the Bank of England, or the Fed's earlier versions, these are pretty explicit things. So it would have been easy to miss, and I think that was, with the right escape clauses that said, hey, if inflation's going up and output's going down, we're going to have some kind of trade-off, that would have helped. So that's the only point I'll add.
Yeah.
And I want to add on the forward guidance being constraining. We don't argue that the FOMC felt they were constrained at that time. Our work is about market perceptions, and we argue that there were reasons for the market to think that the FOMC is constrained, and that appearance could have was probably an issue for how the markets were responding to Fed's communication. So I don't think we disagree as much as you portray that. We thought markets thought that the FOMC is constrained. So that's one point. Regarding the publication of the forecasts, we understand the constraints on publishing the staff forecasts, and actually we present it as an option that we downplay in any recommendations that we make. We do think it would be very valuable, as you argue, to produce and publish SEP forecast, we add to that, it would be also valuable to connect those dots to avoid the very significant problem that the public has in terms of inferring the reaction functions. So if you want to clarify your reaction function, it's not useful to have disconnected dots where on top of it you need to kind of solve that unsolvable problem. Who said what in conjunction with their macroeconomic beliefs?
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, just on the SEP, maybe a little bit more. I mean, Anna had this great quote from a paper from Ben where saying it's costly to send the wrong signal, right? And I don't know, I mean, I wonder, Eric, whether the SEP isn't like problematic in that regard. You said it's great as it is, but you know, everyone pays attention only to the median dot, basically. And in times of high uncertainty, or at least there's a lot of attention to the median dot, it's sometimes caricatured, as Nick was saying. In times of high uncertainty, the median forecast is more likely to be wrong than at other times. And so it is kind of more likely to be a wrong signal. And so I was wondering what, you know, I'm very much with Anna that it could be, you know, it would be much easier to infer the reaction function if we had dots, if the public had the dots connected to the macro forecast. I was wondering, Eric, maybe also whether you see other versions of the SEP that could be useful, and also whether either of you have thought about what the Fed could do in terms of scenarios, publishing scenarios, whether that would be helpful as well. So, you know, in short, like, should we do something else than the SEP, in addition to maybe publishing it more regularly?
Let me turn to Brian.
Brian Sack. So I share some of the reservations about FATE, the average inflation targeting and the makeup. But if we accept it and we have ourselves in that context and we think that generating this inflation overshoot is stabilizing in models, then it seems like there's one glaring omission from the communications, which is I believe the FOMC never had to reveal its hand on how much overshooting on inflation it actually anticipated. And it's not, you know, it's not hardwired into the regime, right? And it's flexible, and that was, you know, purposeful or needed maybe to get them there. But even things they don't agree on, they typically have to like show a projection of. And what happened in this case was the overshooting. I mean, I think they were trying to generate an overshooting, but it was hard enough to do that it was actually occurring beyond the horizon of the SEP. So I guess, do you agree that was a big omission? And maybe the FOMC should have made an exception and actually communicated its anticipation of this overshoot, even though it was occurring beyond their normal forecast horizon.
So we looked at that briefly, and I think the flexibility of the framework was associated with the reluctance to change inflation target. But when you look at the communication before the framework review, there were examples made by Fed officials which were saying, well, if we want to now make up, depending on when you start, we may need to go for 10 years with 2.5. Well, how do you communicate 2.5 for 10 years without convincing the public that you actually did update your target? So the flexible aspect, I think, was in part addressing this issue that we don't want to take a change in the target, but nevertheless we want to have the flexibility. It came at the cost then of that confusing communication that followed. And in face of the shocks that were not complementary with each other, that became a problem in terms of understanding the reaction function.
Maybe I'll give Anna and your co-authors and Eric a chance to make any final comments. You have further reactions to the discussion? Go ahead.
I would like to comment on one point raised by Eric regarding term premium, how they matter, how they don't matter. If you want to design optimal policy, there is long-standing literature saying that if the Fed can control uncertainty, if the Fed affects uncertainty and can control it, this becomes an integral part of the reaction function. And optimal design of monetary policy will take these effects into account. And Ben has discussed optimal policy under uncertainty in his wonderful speech in 2007, which was very influential in our research as well. So it matters, term premium matters to the extent that the Fed is controlling that type of uncertainty. There is a lot of discussion what the effects of uncertainty and term premium are on the real economy, and I don't think we have settled that debate. But the moment you start moving these things around, you are also in charge in designing your optimal policy, taking it into account.
I won't say a lot, but Michael asked a question about the SCP and should we modify it or design it. And actually the authors talk about, they want to see more scenario analysis or linking the dots to the macro forecasts. And I'm open to all of that, but I just thought that does create more work. You know, if you start doing scenarios, now you're multiplying the amount of work that goes into the SCP by a factor of a couple times. And so, there's some costs of doing that. And I thought just the SCP as it is not that, is basically not that much work to do and is very, very informative. And if you just want an easy, quick thing, I see it is a low cost and very beneficial way to increase communication with the markets, right? I mean, just think, come the end of July, we're all going to want to know what the dots are, and we're not going to know, right? I mean, we'll infer it from speeches, but that's all we're going to know. So.
Yeah, just two very quick closing remarks. So, Eric, I don't underestimate the value of the staff's ability to do a forecast knowing it won't be in the public light. And anyone who doesn't agree, I've spent a lot of my research life reading transcripts. As I always tell people, I describe them as the world's most boring play unless you're a monetary geek, in which case they're awesome. Like 2016, 2017, the debate that took place around the FOMC table on what R-star was, and if you sort of put this in the broader context, the worry about low R-star and the undershoots is really something that went on 2014. We sort of documented a bit in the paper. You can see the Fed memos from 2014, 15, 16 about this, and the ability to make different assumptions on fiscal, which my sort of early career was in the Bank of England, and there you have to take the government's published path, even when you don't believe it. So I can see value in that, but I think our stronger point was to get something out there that really conveys the assessment. And then just to try and provide a bridge between the first presentation and our own, I think the word, and we talk about this a lot in the paper, and it wasn't because we had read yours and sort of meant to add it. I think the really key thing that is in both is the idea of preemption in monetary policy, this idea that you really don't want to, in your models, let things run and not take action in advance. And we sort of document that it looks like there was a little bit of less preemption, and that's a sort of important thing. There's loads of other things in the paper, and you should read them, or you should come back at 2 o'clock and the other panel, and I'll reveal all the other things then.
Well, you stole my thunder. So thank you to the authors and discussants. These are, I thought, really good papers that were really insightful and helpful for thinking about the framework review. And we now have a nice break, and at 2 o'clock we will hear wisdom from 4 Fed experts. So see many of you there at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.